Welcome to another episode of the brand called You. Today I have a very senior professional, Mr. Anil Goel, with me. Anil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. Anil is a Tata Group veteran of 35 years. Anil is also an author, and anyone who writes books is a man straight after my heart. So he's an author of a book called The Mask Behind the Face. Anil, tell me a little bit about your early career.
Basically, I'm a career Tata person. I started my career with Tata Tea, company that was known as Tata Tea in the good old days.
Yeah.
Now it's known as Tata Consumer Products.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the course of my career, I first started with the tea business and went through, multiple functions in the organization, from internal audit, corporate finance, SBUs, and so on and so forth, and eventually in the tea plantations in South India.
Right.
Now, the early part of my career was very interesting because, that was the time that company was going through from a very embryonic stage.
Mm-hmm.
It was in the process of evolving.
Okay.
And in the early 80s, as a youngster and as a middle management person, I could sort of visualize and connect the dots on what the leadership had in plan for the organization and where they saw it 20 years down the line. So it's important that I say this because many years later, when I came back to the company, as a CFO, many of the things that I implemented and facilitated the management to execute were actually conceptualized in the early 80s.
Okay.
So that's a very interesting thing and that's what I've written about in my book also, that what really happens is that it's important for management to see the smoke signals and be able to preempt the wind change.
Correct.
And that help you then decide how to take the organization forward.
Fair enough.
So for me, the significant learning in the early part of my career was basically not to rely on status quo, not to take things for granted, to be sensitive to the facts that the sands are shifting all the time, and therefore read the smoke signals that are around you and what the environment is telling you about your business and how therefore, you need to change things in your business to remain combative and competitive. That was the early part of my learning, which I sort of relied upon pretty much through my career.
Very interesting. So Anil, which Tata companies did you work for?
So I worked for Tata Tea. I mean, it used to be called Tata Finlay when I started with them, Tata Tea, then it became Tata Consumer Products, and now it's known as Tata
Beverages.
Tata Beverages, and now it's known as Tata Consumer Products. It's gone through multiple avatars, which is interesting. So my association with Tata Tea or Tata Consumer Products, whatever we wish to call it, was from 1982 till 2004. And in between, then I had moved to Indian Hotels. And I worked with Indian Hotels for the latter half of my career. And I became CFO of Indian Hotels, and subsequently I joined the board, became Executive Director of Finance. And then eventually I retired from Indian Hotels.
I see. Okay.
So yeah, that's right. So basically my career was very interesting that I sort of almost, split my association with the group in two subsects, in the tea business and, in the hotel business. So it was
very
interesting.
So Anil, tell me let's talk a little bit about the Tata Group. It is one of the most highly respected groups in this country with all the right ethical practices, etc., etc. What is the DNA of the group that makes it such a highly respected group? I mean, I know Mr. Ratan Tata, I read about him and I read what he thinks, etc. But as someone who's a career professional, what are your thoughts?
I think it's an interesting question, and I'll tell you, and it's an amazing group because it's been in business for more than 130 years.
Correct.
And I think the unique thing about the Tata Group, the way I see it, is that the Tata Group have selflessly invested in nation building, and that's the way I see it as an insider and as a person who took great pride to be associated with the group. And the difference is this: the difference is that their belief is that when you invest to create jobs, to create infrastructure and go into sectors. And I'm talking of an era when, equity was scarce and investments were limited. So I'm talking of that era when they actually, made mega investments. So their belief was that when you do all of that, economic return will come in any case. So the starting point is not economic return. The starting point is much larger social objectives of basically creating infrastructure and opportunities on the ground, and then the rest will follow. So I think that is what really is the fundamental difference between the group ethos and other large business houses. And I think at an individual level, and all the people, lakhs of people that work with the group and that are associated with the group, there is great pride to be associated with the House of Tatas. And you know that you are comfortable in doing the right things. You'll be supported if you just take the right decisions. Integrity, high levels of ethics. It's the doors open for you when you present your visiting card and say you're from the House of Tatas. So I think that's what really makes the group really stand apart. And I mean, look at somebody like me. I grew up in Jamshedpur, right? I did my schooling there, and life was all about Tisco and Telco, as those companies were known in those days.
Right.
So when I finished my education and I was out in the job market, for me to just join the House of Tata was a subconscious nudge. There was no thinking and there was no planning and so on and so forth. And the company that I joined, which Tata Tea in those days was known as Tata Finlay.
Yeah.
It was still a sterling company. It was not a very well-known company. It was a small company. I had no idea what that organization was all about. But merely because it had the prefix of Tata, I just, I applied for it. When I got the job, I just took it. I had no idea what I was getting into. And, the rest, like this, is history. So I think that's the uniqueness of the House of Tatas.
And, just one more question. What are the values that every Tata employee seems to be able to carry, which makes the group such a strong group in terms of the value systems and the way you project yourselves?
I think, what we have practiced in the course of our careers is to basically have respect for the ecosystem in which we operate. So yes, we do recognize the importance of taking care of our workforce, to respect our workforce, take care of them, because if you take care of your workforce, then the workforce takes care of the organization. But I think the belief is larger. The belief is that the entire ecosystem, which is your vendors, your customers, and your employees, if you take care of all of them, then obviously you're creating economic value for your shareholders as well. I think that is a very strong belief in the system, that you respect your ecosystem and everything's taken care of. And I'll give an example. Like in my early days when I was in the tea plantations, the kind of willful voluntary investments that we would make for the welfare of our workforce in the plantations was beyond belief. We had, and I'm talking of my generation, so now since I've retired many years back from the tea business, we are talking of fifth generation workforce working for us, which is rather unprecedented. So they moved into the tea plantations, they lived there, and generations after generations, they continue to work for us in the plantation. So investments in housing, water, sanitation, education, medical care, creches, the works.
The whole townships are created, actually. Isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. We went beyond the call of duty to take care of our workforce. And I mean, it's all in the public domain, even after 26/11, what the Tatas did, in the Taj, and for the unfortunate colleagues who lost their life, or for the
Were you still with Indian Hotels when that happened?
Yeah. I was very much in Indian Hotels. I was a finance director in those days, and my office was in those days in the hotels. I was there in the thick of it, and
that must have been quite a traumatic.
It is actually beyond belief, because no textbook, no manual, no codification, no discussion ever prepares you in the corporate world for something that we went through. It was clearly traumatic. But the point I'm making is that, you see, whilst the business had been impacted and the flagship hotel of the company had been brutally assaulted, the first thing that the Tatas thought about was the employees and the guests. What is it we need to do for those who have been impacted? Within the first 48 hours, a trust was formed, it was funded, and liquidity was created to help. So it's just, it's a very important example of, how the group thinks very differently. And I'll give you another example. In my tea days when I was CFO for Tata Beverages, it's got so many names, I keep getting confused.
I know.
So, at that point in time, we had taken a very strategic decision that, the company had evolved so much, and we had now moved into consumer-facing marketing of branded products, that our earlier core competence of plantation ownership was no longer relevant to us. So the board gave us a mandate that, look, I think we should now need to exit the plantations. But the brief to the management is find a solution of change in ownership where the employees don't lose their jobs. So they didn't want a kind of a plain vanilla exit and not really bothered about what the incoming owner does. So the whole idea was find a solution where existing employees, entire 30,000 workforce, their jobs are protected and they get ownership. So I'm cutting a very long story short, but what we designed eventually after a fair amount of struggle was the first ever employee buyout,
I see.
which is what happened. Now, this is a story that needs to be told because I don't think too many people are really aware of it. But in my opinion, it's one of the most remarkable things
So tell
that
me about it.
the House of Tatas did. So basically, we created a structure and we brought in financing where, after the organization was valued, liquidity was provided in the hands of the employees and the workforce to buy that entity. So the 30,000 employees, including the pluckers, plantation labor, became the owners of that division, which was a division in Tata Tea and became an independent company thereafter. And Tata Tea retained a minority shareholding in the company to give them comfort that we are there, but you're independent. And then, for the lenders and finances also to have the comfort that, it's not that, you're just cutting the umbilical cord. And I'm telling you, it's been a remarkable journey because I think that company is now almost 13, 14 years, as a standalone independent company, still unlisted, but profitable. And, the moral of the story is that the House of Tatas had the wherewithal and, let's say, the awareness to recognize that the future of that business lay in an alternate ownership model. That is the beauty of the thinking. And it's very important because this is an example of a balance between very strong emotions and the same emotions helping you take a decision for the future of that entity.
Correct.
Because this is a very enterprise that for 15 years, 16 years, they took such much pride in and invested money, and it was a showcase for the House of Tatas. Whenever the who's who used to visit India, invariably they would make a beeline and come to Munnar and experience what the Tatas were doing in Munnar, the plantations.
Right.
It was a remarkable transformation that had taken place. But when the business parameters changed, which is what I talk about, because there are times when the external environment changes so dramatically that what is your core competence is no longer a core competence. And that business cannot survive with the overheads that typical corporates have. So it needed to reinvent itself, and to reinvent itself, it needed to be independent. It needed to think afresh, and which is what the Tatas enabled it to do. So it's a remarkable story, actually.
I agree. I agree. So before I move to your book, one more question. How is a 130-year-old group adjusting to millennials?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's an interesting journey. And I think they're very clearly making an effort because I have recently even heard of the chairman, Mr. Chandrasekhar, talking about digital solutions need to be put in place across sectors and organizations to basically deal the requirements of the future very clearly. They do have in their portfolio very many young, exciting brands like Starbucks, Titan, Tanish themselves are addressing the millennials. They have Fast Track, which is addressing the millennials. Even the tea business has opened, tea parlors. I think they call them Tata Chai. And even in hospitality, we have introduced a brand named Ginger, which is basically addressing the millennials. So I think quite clearly the group is doing a lot. But obviously, I think the pace at which the millennials are growing as a market, and their demands and their expectations and their behavioral pattern needs to be tracked and it needs to be addressed. But I'm sure the House is addressing it.
I'm sure. Thank you, Anil. Anil, tell me a little bit about your book, The Mask Behind the Face.
So, the idea of writing a book germinated in my mind pretty much in sync with the timing of my retirement. And I just believe that it's important for me to capture my own experience. And based upon that experience, my overwhelming belief that, management, in order to succeed, needs to deal with the winds of change that are sort of engulfing us. And, there are times that we sort of don't really read the signals, we don't read the barometer correctly, and we get caught kind of blindsided. That was the concept of what I wanted to write about.
Right.
And I wanted to lean upon my experience and demonstrate how the two organizations I worked for in the course of my journey with them over 4 decades, how we did it correctly and we succeeded, and where we didn't do it correctly and therefore we faltered, and therefore what we're doing about it. And then that conversation leads to my belief on the fact that in today's complex world, the success of an organization is now, in my opinion, jointly in the hands of the board, the CEO, and the CFO. I think life has become too complicated. So these three are, in my view, joined at the hips. Okay. And they have to collectively take responsibility for what needs to be done. And then I sort of gone on to argue the case that, the CEO must focus very strongly on product and customer. Now, we all know it, that obviously they do it. So what's so great about, Anil Goel saying it? But the fundamental difference is recognizing the fact that the customer's behavioral pattern is now changing almost by the hour, by the month, by the quarter.
Right.
Because brands are becoming fragile, right? And the brand pool is becoming very vulnerable. So one cannot take the customer for granted because behavioral pattern can change overnight and loyalty can collapse overnight. So CEOs have to focus very strongly on what's happening in the market, what's happening with my product, and how can I change my product or what needs to be changed to keep exciting and delighting my customer and protecting my market turf and growing my business.
Okay.
The CFOs, in my opinion, need to focus very strongly on scanning the environment, very strongly, because it's not good enough to prepare 12-month business plans, 3-year business, 5-year business plans. I mean, in my opinion, that's all irrelevant. What is most relevant is to scan the environment and find out and to track and monitor external influences that are going to impact my business in some form or the other.
Okay.
And the third element I've talked about is the role of the board. So what I've explained in my book is that, in my opinion, because life has become so complicated and, we see so many businesses are collapsing, there are so many problems in the corporate world. So there is an underlying problem, right? What is that underlying problem? There are multiple,
Correct.
but I've zeroed on one or two. The fundamental problem is the composition of the board itself. So my view is that amongst the independent directors, there needs to be one independent director who has actually sector domain knowledge. It's important.
Correct.
Very often we find that we have luminaries and heavy hitters and people of great repute, very successful in their businesses on the boards, and they're adding great value. But when the chips are down and there's a problem with the business, they can't really zero down on the central issue because they don't have that touch and feel of the business. So you end up actually relying on the same management team that to begin with got you into the problem, right? So if the organization is facing a problem, then very clearly, the people running the business have not been able to resolve it, did not see it, or got caught blindsided. So there's an issue that needs to be resolved. So how do you resolve it? So it's hopefully if the management team can fix it, great. But there's a possibility that they cannot fix it, so they need some guidance, they need some insights, they need some nudging. And that nudging can come only if the think tank in the board has that knowledge and has that wherewithal to challenge and say, look, I don't agree. How can you do this? But, so-and-so happened at that time, or you did this at that time, and therefore why you're not looking at it from an alternate point of view. Which means the point I'm making is understanding risk.
Correct.
That the business is facing, the enterprise is facing, and that the sector is exposed to is something that the boards need to spend time on.
Correct.
And it's all intertwined, in my opinion, because everything is changing. Your consumers' behavioral pattern is changing. Therefore, the products and the service you provide have to be continuously looked at and challenged.
Correct.
And good standards, good benchmarks don't last very long now because of these changes that I'm talking about.
Very good.
So now, I'll give you an example. I mean, I've been influenced very strongly by Alvin Toffler, from my early youth. And Toffler talked about all of this in the 70s and 80s, when he wrote his books. And I sort of, adapted to it, understood what he's talking about, and it influenced my thinking as a manager. But I tell you, what Toffler talked about in the 70s and 80s is so important now. I would mandate everybody to read Alvin Toffler now, Future Shock and Power Shift.
Yeah.
And Power Shift is all about shifting of knowledge, right? Shifting of power because of shifting of knowledge.
Correct. Very true.
People who have information have power.
Hmm.
So, that's what we are now living in, right? The digital world.
Absolutely.
So
True.
uh,
Very
that's
true.
basically what the book is about.
Very true. So, Anil, let's move to a few personal questions. I've got time for just a few personal questions now. Uh, my first question is: are there any people other than Alvin Toffler who have had a strong influence on you? And if yes, what have you learned from them?
I think, I give credit to, the manager that I am, to three individuals who very strongly influenced my career.
Mhm.
And I'm greatly indebted to all three of them. So the first is the gentleman named Bobby Sabiki,
Mhm.
who unfortunately is no more. So he was the joint managing director and CFO of Tata Tea when I joined the company in '82.
Okay.
So I had the great fortune of, I was an assistant manager and he was the joint managing director. So obviously my exposure to him was limited. But those 5, 6 years that I saw him work helped me understand, many of the skills that a CFO needs to have to succeed in business. So Bobby Sabiki influenced me tremendously, and I remember, his style in the way he operated and what I need to learn from him.
Mhm.
The second is a gentleman named R.K. Krishna Kumar. He was a managing director of Tata Tea, managing
I know
director
him.
of
Mhm.
Gels,
Mhm.
and on the board of Tata Sons. Presently, a trustee with the Tata Trust.
Mhm.
So I had the great fortune of working under his supervision for almost 25, 30 years. Better part of my career, actually. Pretty much all of my career, I worked, directly, indirectly, and as I progressed in life, directly under his supervision. So from him, what I learned was that every decision that you take while running a business, just ensure that it benefits the employees or the customer or the product. Just make sure, just do that mental check all the time.
Mhm.
If either of the three or all the three of them are benefiting, then you're doing the right things
Mhm.
in the decisions that you take. And the third individual who had a very strong influence on me is Mr. Nashir Sonawala. He was a former finance director of Tata Sons. He was also a trustee with the Tata Trust, and he was on the boards of both the companies that I worked for. He was the vice chairman of both the companies. So, by virtue of him being a very eminent finance personality in the country, it was a great privilege for me to be able to seek his audience and seek his guidance on complicated matters that I had to deal with once in a while. And from Mr. Sunawala, I learned the fine art of balancing between being cautious and taking a risk.
Wonderful.
It's a fine art,
Yeah.
because if you're overcautious, you might put your money in a bank account and earn 5%, right?
Mhm.
And if you take too many risks, then you have no further money to grow the business.
Mhm.
So there's a delicate art, and what that delicate art is, I learned from him,
Wonderful.
because when we would go and seek his counsel, and he would review what we plan to do, and his insights, the questions that he asked, the guidance that he gave, and the other thing I learned from him was always be respectful of the shareholders, because at the end of the day, you're custodian of the shareholders,
Mhm.
and one cannot overstate that. It
Mhm.
always needs to be borne in mind. At the end of the day, everything that we do must all culminate in value creation for the shareholders.
Mhm.
So the combination of the knowledge that I was able to absorb from these three personalities, I think I was really privileged to
Mhm.
have that opportunity to be in the same room as them and to
Fantastic.
learn from them, and hopefully pass some of that down to my colleagues, my younger colleagues.
Fantastic. Uh, you spoke about younger colleagues and past downs. The question is this: that what would, after such an illustrious career and so much success, what would your advice be to young managers, young individuals starting their careers today?
So actually, my advice would be what I just mentioned, that everything that you do in life while running a business, look at it from the perspective of the product, the employee,
Mhm.
and the customer. So if you have those three in mind all the time, the other people in the ecosystem are all taken care of. The other thing is actually a quote from John Lennon, and I quote: "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans." Unquote. So it's a very simple quote, but it's also a very profound quote, and it's so relevant for business that one can keep making multiple plans and assume that you're heading in the right direction, but life deals a very different card to you. which means preempt what's going to happen, keep looking at the future, and have the wherewithal to keep making changes because the sand keeps shifting. So I think young managers, if they bear that in mind, they will do well in life.
Very nice. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you.
My pleasure.
I'm grateful you come on my show.
Thank you. Thank you for having invited me. I really enjoyed interacting with you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.